Welcome to our continuing series of webinars that are focusing on best practices for closing the pandemic learning gap in our Ohio schools. This webinar will focus on how our educators are dealing with the learning gap created by the pandemic and how our Ohio schools are assisting our special needs students in closing that gap. We have a great lineup of panelists that will address this issue during this hour-long webinar. Hi, my name is Jeff Good, and I'm the Chief Education Technology Officer for PBS Western Reserve located in Kent, Ohio. We're fortunate to have received funding for this project through the Broadcast Educational Media Commission in collaboration with the Ohio Department of Education. All of our webinars, the accompanying podcasts, and the supportive resources can be found on our website that you see along the bottom of your screen. We're on YouTube Live tonight. So if you're attending this live event remotely and you have any questions at all, feel free to drop them in the live chat or take an opportunity, use your phone, capture that QR code that you see on your screen, and that'll take you to a form where you can ask your question. And we'll make sure we share those questions with our panelists throughout the webinar. So, hey, let's get started. We have 4 distinguished panelists this evening, starting with Lauren Nash, Principal, PEP Phoenix, Positive Education Program. Johanna Ward, the Ohio Department of Education, Director of the Office for Exceptional Children. Dr. Katie Fallow from Boardman Local Schools, the Director of Student Services. And Laura McBride from Springfield Local Schools, making sure we understand that's in Mahoning County, and she is the Director of Special Services. So before we begin our webinar, what's interesting is remote learning through this pandemic, and as we're wrapping up this pandemic, has really caused some challenges, especially for families with students with learning disabilities. So let's take a little closer look as we look at this ABC News update.
Taking a closer look this morning at the impact the pandemic is having on special needs students in the U.S. The CDC says in-person learning is possible with the right safety precautions, and many parents are pushing to get their kids back into the classroom. But families of students with disabilities say they are facing a unique uphill battle, and their kids are being left behind.
When her St. Louis suburb first closed schools, Ashley Young saw it as an opportunity.
You know, you have these kind of grandiose ideas of this homeschool scenario that you're going to do.
But Ashley soon noticed her 6-year-old son, Miles, was slipping.
Can you say hi really quick? Hi. The kids with Down syndrome, they see if you don't use it, you lose it. We're like, great, okay, he knows all his colors. And then all of a sudden, 2 months later, he doesn't remember his colors anymore.
She says outside the classroom, Miles doesn't get the repetition he needs. Some lessons from his Individualized Education Program, or IEP, he can't receive at all. Even classes that otherwise work well on Zoom don't work well for Miles.
It was just too much to hear multiple people talking at a time, or sometimes just the way that the volume comes across on a Zoom.
During a recent Zoom class, things start out fine. Then Miles has trouble with the iPad. When Ashley comes to help, he's not happy.
Get out.
But once Ashley leaves, Miles makes a break for it.
Not Zoom. Stop. No.
And as soon as Ashley turns her back again, Miles is out. This is 6 minutes into class.
Were there moments that stuck out to you where you thought this just isn't working?
A kind of a turning point for me was I didn't necessarily like the mom that I was becoming, and it was just really overwhelming for both of us.
So Ashley resorted to hiring a private specialist to work with Miles in person, part-time.
I don't feel like he was getting I don't want to say any education, but it's true. I mean, if I'm being honest, I don't feel like he learns anything from Zooms online.
It's a sentiment we're hearing from special needs families all across the country, like the Azeltine family of Charlotte, North Carolina. 6-year-old Connor is partially deaf and too young to read closed captions on Zoom.
He relies pretty much on myself or my husband sitting with him. Both my husband and I work. And no one's coming to us and saying, hey, we're going to pay your bills.
Courtney says to learn through a screen, Connor must first learn to read, a catch-22 since he's learning that virtually.
See the other kids his age reading paragraphs, reading sentences, or they could at least sound out words. And he can't do any of that. And it's heartbreaking.
She says the hardest part is that Connor is now old enough to realize he's falling behind.
The teacher put the answers up on the screen for them to all check themselves, and he didn't get a single one right. And he looked at me and put his head on my shoulder and started to cry.
Over in Pueblo West, Colorado, Kevin Blunt says his son Makai is supposed to receive regular speech therapy to help with his nonverbal autism. But since it can't be done via Zoom, Makai hasn't had speech therapy in almost a year.
We've even asked, are we able to sign a waiver and get specialists like speech therapy to come to the house? No, we can't do any of that at this time.
The family says the school also refused to loan them the sensory items normally used to help Makai learn.
Basically, putting Makai in front of a screen, it's useless. It really is.
You know, we've heard for years, no child left behind, no child left behind. But we really feel like the kids with an IEP or special needs are specifically being left behind.
Jennifer Manning, director of special education for the neighborhood charter schools in New York City, says parents are facing an impossible task.
We always say that just because you have a student with special needs as your child does not make you an expert on how to teach a kid with special needs.
At the end of the month, she hopes to welcome her special needs students back to the classroom, where they can attend virtual classes with the added help of in-person professionals. But she says that's not as easy as it sounds.
We have a building in which because of code, we can't open our windows. And so all of these precautions that are told to be put in place in order to make a building more safe are really, really complicated.
In the meantime, she says her school is working to make online learning as fruitful as possible.
If I'm a visual learner, I'm always going to have that visual piece to go back to. If I'm an audio learner, I'm always going to have something to click on so something can be read aloud to me. So we've sent home weighted vests, and we've sent home special seats and special sensory tools that we would have in the building so that kids and families have access to those tools at home. We know that this is not our ideal situation, but what can we do to make it better?
It's the kind of support the Blunts and the Azeltines say they're not receiving from their respective schools, but they intend to keep fighting.
I'll scream and I'll fight and I'll yell and I'll do whatever I have to do for someone to listen, because it's critical. It truly is critical.
Now, since we did those interviews, Makai Blunt is back in school for now. His school says they will monitor COVID-19 cases day by day. As for virtual learning for special needs students, the school says, quote, specialists and therapists continued to meet with those students and their parents virtually and provided as close to the same services possible as required on the student IEP plans. Now, an administrator for Connor Azeltine's school tells us we have followed appropriate procedures and made solid educational decisions in the midst of the most disruptive event I have experienced as an educator. We have worked and will continue to work in good faith with the Azeltines to make appropriate educational decisions for Connor. And as for Miles Young, Ashley says he has been welcome back in school for a while now, but because he has a heart condition, his doctors have deemed him too high risk. So both he and his sister Lucia will have to stay home for the foreseeable future.
Welcome back. Our first panelist, Lauren Nash, has worked in special education for nearly 2 decades, beginning her career in the classroom and now serving as a school principal. In her current role, she leads PEP Phoenix, one of Positive Education Program's 6 day treatment centers. PEP Phoenix, located in Parma Heights, specializes in serving children with significant cognitive delays in addition to mental health challenges. Previously, Ms. Nash was the special education supervisor for PEP Prentice Autism Center. She also worked as an intervention specialist for the Lakewood City Schools and for Positive Education Program. She earned a BA in education with a dual major in elementary and middle school education and also special education from Gannon University. Ms. Nash also earned an MA in educational leadership from Baldwin Wallace and holds a pre-K to 12 administrator's license. Lauren, thank you so much for your time. And my connection with PEP was an article I ran across. And then really what led me to asking you to be a panelist, a news article from cleveland.com that talked about all the efforts that PEP were undertaking in dealing with these special needs students and helping close that, working with them remotely and helping close that pandemic learning gap. So what are some programs? Tell us a little bit of first of all, what exactly is Positive Educational Program, PEP?
So Positive Education Program has been around for 50 years now in Northeast Ohio, and we have 6 state treatment centers that focus on mental health and education. So we have centers, we have 4 periods that focus on the social emotional learning, and we have the other periods that focus on our academics. Our classrooms are set up with an intervention specialist, an ATC, which is an associate teacher counselor who does the social emotional learning work, as well as TAs. So we're set up to serve all special ed education students. We have 72 current students, grades K to 12 plus, and really have had our first full year back after the pandemic. And, we are working towards, gaining speed and catching and helping get students caught up after being out of the classroom for quite some time.
I know you shared with me some points, and I know one of the things you talked about was as you look at closing that pandemic learning gap, you look at data and you say something about 4 different points. Can you talk a bit about that data that you look at?
Right. So I had taken over right at the beginning of the pandemic as the principal, and we were working on data points, and it was for ELA explicitly. So we had data points from pre-pandemic to remote, when our students were remote, to when they were hybrid, and to when they came back full in-person learning. So we were looking at data points from each 4 of those areas, and we were able to pinpoint and focus our instruction on for each individual student, especially when it came to their reading skills. As we have special education students, they're already behind a little bit or a lot. And we are really trying to focus and use data to drive our instruction for ELA, English Language Arts reading, for our students who are behind. So what we were able to do is we were able to hone in on specifics for each individual students and try to bridge the gap from time that we lost in person.
So talk a bit about these 2 words. What is it? Structure and predictability when you're dealing with trying to close that learning gap with our special needs students.
So when talking to a couple of the teachers to prepare for this interview, we were talking about routines that are in the classroom that they follow. So warm-up drills, things that they can do to get the kids ready to learn. So that's doing some sensory things, brain breaks, just to get the kids ready to be in that space to learn. And that's all part of their routines. And one thing that we had to work on during coming back from the, hybrid to full in-person was their stamina, their work stamina. Our kids struggle with their schedules being changed. Some kids were up all night, having being able to play video games. Some kids weren't getting enough sleep. So really, when they came back into the classroom, focusing on increasing their work and their time on task and we had to increase work stamina by using, routines within the classroom. It really hit home how difficult it was not having a school routine in place for these students. For our students, for any kid, for my kids at home, just having being fatigued from a whole full 8 hours of school, 6 hours of school that they're gone. So that was one major thing that I noticed. And right now, one thing that I'm noticing is we are seeing some trauma from the pandemic with the kids.
I know that we've touched on this with all of this is our 5th webinar. Talk a bit about that social emotional side of how this pandemic and this learning gap and what are some things that you've addressed as far as that social emotional side with our students?
So our social emotional programming is meant to improve and strengthen the kids' social skills, and also to help them establish coping skills. So when they do become angry or upset, they have these tools to lean upon, and that we can help them walk through. One thing that we have learned is rebuilding or building new relationships with our students. We've learned at PEP that relationships are key. Teachers making connections with students are found to have lasting effects with our kids. And they thrive when they have someone that they can relate to, that they can help with co-regulation when they're having, an issue, or when they become emotionally dysregulated. So we're really seeing that, relationships are key when dealing with the student social emotional aspects.
So I often know answers to questions before I ask them, but how important is that parent-family connection with your students and helping get over that pandemic learning gap?
So one really unique thing about PEP in general is we have a really great homeschool component. We have community-based case managers that most of our students have access to. And what it is it's a liaison, a person that, is able to go into the home, meet with the parents, help transfer skills that we're teaching at school to home. This was key when we were during the pandemic. We had a second person trying to, check in on families, hold that relationship. And we are very unique. Not any other program has, that homeschool connection like we do. And we are very lucky to have it. They were an extra hand to run packets out right at the beginning of the pandemic when we shut down, when we had to get something out to kids. Medications to students. We have students that see a doctor here. So we had to get medications out to students. Like, we had so many people involved in orchestrating services for our kids from day one. And it's just we really couldn't have done it without those people within our program for connecting school and home.
Lauren, I can't thank you enough for your input. I certainly applaud your efforts and all of the efforts that you've been doing, whether it was prior to the pandemic or during or after. So we really appreciate you, and we appreciate you being part of this webinar. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for the opportunity.
Well, our next panelist is Johanna Ward, and she serves as a director for the Office for Exceptional Children for the Ohio Department of Education. The Office for Exceptional Children provides that leadership, the assistance, and oversight to school districts and other entities that provide that differentiated instruction for students with disabilities and gifted students. They administer state and federal funds, coordinate and administer programs to improve outcomes for students with disabilities and those gifted students, and provides that technical assistance to districts and educational agencies around issues of compliance with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act. Johanna has 30 years of experience in education. Her background includes direct classroom experience, building level leadership, as well as experience with mental health services in schools for students. Johanna most recently has served as the executive director for the Center for Continuous Improvement, and prior to that appointment, she served as director of the Office for Improvement and Innovation for 3 years, assistant director in the Office for Exceptional Children for 12 years, and then she served as the deputy superintendent at the Ohio Department of Youth Services and the Franklin County Court Juvenile Detention Facility, providing that oversight of 10 different departments, providing youth programming in areas such as education, transition, and mental health services. Throughout her career, she has worked with education and community service agencies to help students with special needs succeed both academically as well as in their communities. Ward has received a Master's of Education from the University of Dayton and has a Bachelor of Science degree from The Ohio State University in Family Relations and Human Development with a focus on adolescent development. She's also a licensed professional clinical counselor in the state of Ohio. I don't know if I have heard a better, well-varied resume, Johanna, and I appreciate you being here on our webinar.
Certainly. Thanks for having me, Jeff.
So we were talking a little bit before the program started, and I've always enjoyed having a representative from ODE on our panel. So, and oftentimes what districts are really looking at is what are some programs, that ODE and that you've been working with and making that bridging that gap, so to speak, with that pandemic learning gap with our special needs students.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for asking. The Ohio Department of Education has dispersed $6.8 billion in federal COVID relief funding grants, commonly known as ESSER funds. You'll hear us refer to these as ESSER funds. And these monies are to support funding multiple types of initiatives which support learning. 30% of those funds, of that 6.5 billion, was targeted towards learning loss initiatives. Other things include continuity of services, pandemic responses, technology, mental health services. And then together with our state activities, there's $7.64 billion that's total, including the 6.8, that is targeted to learning and learning loss and initiatives which support accelerating learning. So the pandemic data has shown us that math and English language arts proficiency rates have really dropped. So we're really focusing on accelerating learning, and we want to continue that to be our priority focus area. So this past school year, we've provided $75 million to support the work across 51 educational service centers to work with schools and to focus on developing learning recovery plans specific to those school district needs. There are also grants prioritizing nonprofit partners, so summer enrichment and after-school programming. House Bill 169 allocates nearly $90 million for these summer enrichment programs, $45 million for summer learning, and $45 more for after-school opportunities. We had more than 700 applications asking for over $318 million to support that for this summer. Our most vulnerable students are students with disabilities, who we're talking about here. Department of Developmental Disabilities has operated Learning Aid Ohio program since the fall of 2020. And this provides supplemental tutoring and supports for students with disabilities and their families. So we're supporting with some of our ESSER funds to continue that work with another $8 million. Because we know reading proficiency and math has dropped as a result of the pandemic, we are really focusing in on additional literacy supports, dyslexia supports, math, STEM, and high quality instructional materials. And then after school enrichment programs are huge. So we're supporting vendors to administer our ACE program. So while school districts and related educational entities are receiving funds to support accelerating learning, the ACE program will continue to provide opportunities directly to parents, help parents make choices about better supports for their students. And there's $125 million set aside for that purpose.
So you touched on it a bit with that literacy focus. And I know we talked a bit before we went on camera. What are some district examples, one or two district examples that you have in relation to that literacy focus?
Yeah, so let me just talk about East Cleveland, for example, is a school district that comes to mind. There are several initiatives and things happening to support literacy broadly across all our districts. One thing I know that this school district did is really hone in on focusing on not only what the students need, but what the adults need, what the educators need in order to provide that robust, accelerated learning experience for their students. So they focused in on providing the best research-based science of reading and literacy supports they could get into their school district. They focused on a systemic professional development process. They focused on every educator. So all their educators were included, not just some. This was targeted to support all their students in pre-K through grade 12. So they stopped in the middle of the pandemic. They created this plan, which is no easy task, right? With barriers of time and no substitutes and all of that. They set aside a particular day. Monday was set aside as their professional development day. So they took that time to build the capacity of their educators to provide these keys to literacy in this literacy training. They included intervention specialists, their speech language path, their PTs and OTs, their guidance counselors, their career tech, all meant all. They were all included.
So talk a bit about this Ohio's equity tool. What's all involved with that?
Yeah, so excuse me. It's very exciting. I'm sorry. Ohio, lost my voice. Ohio has an equity gap analysis tool. And that, excuse me, that tool is designed to, I'm going to have to get a drink of water. Hang on just a second. That tool is designed to assist our educators individually or in groups in assessing the state of equity at a school or a district. So it's a gap analysis basically, and it highlights 6 components of comprehensive educational equity. Physical equity is embedded within that. So in this tool, each component is addressed in one section, and each section begins with concept framing statements to explain its purpose. Each section also includes a table that lists indicators that capture practices that reflect effective and successful implementation of a comprehensive approach to advance educational equity. So the tool purely is meant to be used for self-assessment purposes. So we can share a link with you. You can share out with your audience here about that. And you can also request support services from our office or our agency to help with your self-assessment.
If your voice will hold up. And that my biggest fear is it's been happening with me today too. So I really appreciate your patience with me also. But you mentioned something about there's some new websites that are out there for those educators who are working with learners who have those complex needs. What are those new websites?
Yeah, so our Office for Exceptional Children, partners with Ocali. And Ocali has really bolstered their website to focus in on teaching diverse learners. They have a Teaching Diverse Learners Center, and they launched a new website titled Access to the General Education Curriculum. So that site is designed to provide information and guidance to educators working with learners who have complex communication, sensory, motor, cognitive needs, and especially learners who have a range of needs but don't qualify for Ohio's alternate assessments based on the alternate assessment decision-making tool. So there's all kinds of great information, videos developed, and resources in this website to support our educators in that space.
Johanna, thank you so much for your time. And we got your voice through everything, got my voice through everything. So it's perfect. So appreciate so much of your time. And what I'll say is, if folks are interested in the ODE website, if they were to go to www.ode.gov and look for the section under Exceptional Children, Office for Exceptional Children, a lot of this material would be available to them.
They could, or they could easily just type in for the literacy piece, they can just type in literacy tools. They can go to Ocali's website and type in literacy access for all there to get those pieces. And the equity tool, they can just simply type in the search box equity tool.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for your time. And we certainly appreciate it. And we appreciate all that the state has done, especially with our special needs students. So we really appreciate you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Well, with more than 700,000 special education students in the state of California, the Delano Union School District is ensuring that their special needs students don't fall behind even when they're online. Let's take a closer look.
All right, Allison, thanks. While the COVID-19 pandemic has changed how we educate our children, teachers are helping parents and students as they adjust. Tonight, 23 APC's Imani Stevens shows us how the Delano Union School District Special Education Department is making sure their students with learning disabilities don't fall behind while they learn online.
There are more than 700,000 special education students in the state, and schools now geared toward online learning. The Delano Union School District is assuring their students with special needs don't fall behind, even online.
It's definitely been challenging for our students and for our parents. It's really forced all of us to really think outside the box and really try to reach students in a way that we didn't think we would ever have to.
Because of the COVID-19 outbreak, students in the Delano Union School District were given either an iPad or Chromebook to continue their education at home.
Or less than? Less than? Okay, put it
Lesson
in.
plan includes the curriculum that they're able to access to the iPads that we sent home. And the curriculum covers everything from mathematics to English language arts, writing, reading, science.
Wendy Terrasas, the director of special education for the school district, says it was important for all students to have equal access to technology.
Look at this.
9?
Oh, yeah? No, 9.
No, 9.
What it is?
5.
Special ed kids need to be educated just like every other student in the world, and they have the same rights and responsibilities as a district to be able to make sure that these kids receive the adequate education that they need. And I think it's really important that they be given this opportunity and that they have the same technology, the same instruction.
And it's teachers like Jessica Villalobos, a moderate to severe special education teacher at Pioneer School in Delano, check in with their students and their parents weekly to help with the changes. Some of her past lessons, necessary life skills learned at the Unique Blend Cafe, the student-run school cafe, are now making a difference, helping out mom and dad at home.
We've been really fortunate that those things that we worked in the classroom, they're able to do at home. So even washing dishes, sorting clothes, helping their parents make small snacks at the house.
I'm Imani Stevens for 23 ABC News, connecting you.
Dr. Katie Fallow is Director of Student Services at Boardman Local Schools. Dr. Fallow has been the Director of Student Services at Boardman Local since 2019. She completed her undergraduate degree at the University of Cincinnati and her doctorate at Youngstown State University. Currently, she's working on acquiring her BCBA licensure in order to better serve students with moderate to intensive needs. Prior to working in Boardman, Katie was a teacher and supervisor at Warren City Schools. Katie is passionate about providing inclusion, equity, and free, appropriate public education to all students with disabilities. Katie, thanks so much for being here. Let's talk a little bit about some of the services that Boardman Local Schools has had to kind of adjust to help bridge that learning gap with those special needs students.
Okay, thank you so much for having us on, Jeff. So it was really a whirlwind over the last 3 years or so. But when I really sat down to think about everything that our staff and teachers and related service personnel did, I had to write it all down. So, we get that call in March of 2022 that schools are closing. And it really was an all hands on deck kind of effort by the team in Boardman. We were distributing Chromebooks and routers to families who didn't have internet service. Teachers were checking in via Zoom with their families, via phone calls. We immediately got Zoom accounts for our intervention specialists who service our students with disabilities. And we said to them, it might not be perfect, but do your best to meet the minutes on Section 7 of the IEP, even remotely to the best of your ability. So my teachers did that to the best of their ability. They logged that time. And then I met with each building weekly just to see what students were we in contact with, what students were we not, who needed food deliveries, who needed a Chromebook, who needed routers. And then people in my office that were still coming in just masked up and went out into the community, dropped that stuff off, and then kind of started all over the next week. And so, similar to, I think, Ashley and Miles in your first video there, we realized very quickly that remote learning wasn't working for our most significant students with disabilities, right? So in alignment with the Mahoning County Board of Health, we wrote waivers for the summer of 2020 and got some of our students with the most significant needs into our building for summer programming. And we also wrote waivers so that we could stay in compliance with our ETR testing. So that was really nice. And then, of course, we thought we'd be back 2020, 2021. We were all hopeful of that when we were on these meetings. And we were very lucky in Boardman that we came back 5 days a week, including our students with disabilities to start. And the teachers of Boardman are the real heroes of this, because instead of using a third-party vendor to provide instruction for our families who weren't ready to send their kiddos back, the teachers in Boardman sat down and decided that they wanted to do the learning, even for our students that were choosing remote at that time. So every child who was remote learning in Boardman during that 2020-2021 school year had access to a general education teacher, had access to an intervention specialist, and their related service personnel during that time, which was really nice. So eventually it got a little cumbersome for our staff that was trying to do both, right? That's a lot. So we went down to 4 days a week. We were in session Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. But on Wednesdays, we still continue to bring our students with disabilities into the building, and also students who maybe were remote learning and whose parents weren't comfortable with them being in the building full time, but we're comfortable bringing them in kind of with reduced staff and with reduced individuals in the building. So that really helped us. And we ended up getting kiddos back from other entities that were not back full time. So some of our scholarship providers and some outside schools that weren't able to bring their kiddos back yet, that lived within Boardman were coming to us saying, hey, can you give us FAPE? Can we come back to Boardman? So we got some kiddos back. And since then, really, Camp Spartan, which is our summer program, has just gotten bigger and bigger every summer. We're getting ready to start it again on Monday. And that'll go on for our students to make sure that there are no learning gaps, or we're closing those gaps. And next year, we're going to continue that online option for our 7th through 12th graders. But similar to this current school year, 2021-22, any student who was online was still tied to an intervention specialist. So we were constantly monitoring them. And then, like Johanna mentioned, those ESSER dollars really came in handy for purchasing Chromebooks. We were able to hire another school psychologist, another counselor, beef up our services from Alta and Meridian, to really try to support the kiddos who were returning to us after having chosen online or remote learning. So it was a fast 3 years.
Well, I listen with interest, because some of the past webinars that we've done, everyone's kind of focused on the summer camp program. And I'm always intrigued on, you talk about your Camp Spartan. Talk a bit about the origin of that, and what group you pulled together, and then how did you kind of put all that together? Because I'm always intrigued by that.
Sure. So like I said, we realized remote learning wasn't working for our most significant kids. A lot of our students that were nonverbal are students with Down syndrome, with autism. And so I just kind of did an all call to my staff, and I was like, who's willing, with these protocols that were approved by the Mahoning County Board of Health at that time? You had to submit a waiver and get it approved. So it had already been approved. Like, who would be comfortable to come in and to service our kids knowing that these precautions were in place? And I was really, the teacher's heart never stops giving or growing, right? Because those who were able to do it volunteered to come back into the buildings that summer of 2020 and to work with our kids. Not all parents were quite ready for it at that time, but since then, we had maybe 5 or 10 kids that first summer that were comfortable with it. Last year we had 15 or 20. This year we're just as big, if not bigger. And the wonderful thing about it is we have an OT, a PT, a speech therapist, an audiologist, a yoga instructor there. We bring in an art teacher. So they're really getting all of their related services. So we're making sure that they're not only sliding back academically, and we're meeting those IEP goals during the summer, but we're also meeting, what's kind of outlined for them as far as the related services. And plus we have a lot of fun too. So it's a great time. You should come visit us, Jeff.
That would be a great idea. That would be a great idea.
I'm extending an invitation to you.
Well, thank you for that. I guess the question I have is, if you look in that, I've used this question before, you shake the magic 8 ball and you ask it, some lessons learned, if you had to think about it, and if you had nothing but time on your hands to make these changes, which of course you didn't, what are some lessons learned? Some of the great success stories you can talk about on how you dealt with the pandemic and dealing with your special needs students, and maybe some of the hurdles. I won't say necessarily difficulties, but the hurdles that you had along the way.
Sure. I think one of the greatest successes was really being able, my teachers did such a phenomenal job of staying in contact with our families. And if they were unable to stay in contact with them, we were able to do well checks. So we were able to reach out to SROs, or we went out ourselves and we were able to say, hey, you haven't been able, you haven't logged on, or we haven't been able to reach you by phone. How's Johnny doing? How's Susie doing? Do you need packets of work? Do you need, our food supplies? What can we help you with? So that was a real success for us. And I think, and this is going to sound a little bit cheesy, is it really brought the Boardman community together, all hands on deck. And we were really one team rowing the boat in the same direction at that time. I think my hurdle was some of those kiddos that I just couldn't get to because they were medically fragile, or their parents, understandably, were not comfortable with them coming back into the building. And so how do I get them services, when the remote option isn't best for them? I actually wrote a grant to try to get an RV that I was going to furnish and put personnel in to bring the RV to the kids' driveway. And I didn't get the grant. It was rejected, but I gave a valiant effort on trying to get a mobile special ed unit in Boardman. But that was probably the biggest hurdle, was not being able to kind of get to every child like we would have wanted to.
So if you think about what are your big plans for, next year and the year after and the year after from all of these great projects that you've worked on?
I think my goal has always stayed the same. And I really want Boardman to be a place where we service any child who wants to be in our district, no matter how significant their disability. The public school is where you get that free and appropriate public education, right? You forfeit that to go to a lot of other places. And I want our parents to know that in Boardman, we will always work to be the place where your child belongs and where your child will make growth and progress. And you don't always have to forfeit that right to FAPE and your right to those services to get what your child needs. You could get it in our district, and we're happy to do that.
Katie, thank you so much. I'm so excited about it. It brings a warmth to my heart when I hear about all the programs, and I especially love the part. And we talked a little bit about, a little bit earlier in regards to that connection with families and how important that was. But I can't begin to tell you, in each of the webinars, one of the common thread that came out was the fact that teachers were so willing to go above and beyond to help those students, combat that learning gap. And you just followed up with that. So I really appreciate that. I think you're doing wonderful things in Boardman. We certainly appreciate your time. And enjoy your summer. I'm sure you'll be busy.
Yes. Thank you so much, Jeff. Happy to be here.
Oh, thank you. Our last panelist is Laura McBride, and she's currently the Director of Special Services at the Springfield Local School District in Mahoning County. She's been in this role for almost 7 years. Laura supervises all special education, gifted, and English learner services, and coordinates all Section 504 evaluation and plans, and supports all district tiered services to support those varying needs of all students. Laura also helps to support Springfield's online learners through a program called Edgenuity. Before Laura came to Springfield as a director, she was an intervention specialist at Springfield Elementary School for 9 years, and then the special education coordinator at Matthews Local Schools for a little over 2 years. So Laura loves learning. She has 2 master's degrees, one in special education and one in administration, and she'll soon complete a doctorate in educational leadership. Laura, thank you so much for your time. Let's talk a little bit about, I'm a South Range guy, so I certainly very familiar with Springfield. So talk a bit about all the great things, or at least the programs that Springfield's had to try to ramp up and implement when this whole learning gap, especially with our special needs students.
Okay, and thank you so much for having me also. It's kind of hard to follow Katie. She's in the district right by me. She's got a bit of a different role with having a much larger school district. So, where I'm at in Springfield, it's a little bit different because I'm looking at, I wear a lot of hats versus just looking at special education. So like you read in the information about me, I focus on all of our students. So, when I looked at presenting on this, and when I look at special education as a whole, I focus on the fact that all students are general education students first. So a lot of the initiatives that I'm going to talk about with you today are things that we've looked at as a whole versus just our special needs students.
Well, let's talk a little bit about what are some of those we talk about. You talk about all students first. What were some of your priority items? I mean, obviously, the minute you found out, our students are going to be remote learners, and what were some of the things you had to ramp up along the way?
Well, initially as a special education supervisor, a lot of what Katie had said, I had done similar things, really had to think very quickly about the fact that we have a legal contract and an IEP, an individualized education plan, that had mandated minutes of services that we needed to provide to students. So looking at our students with just disabilities as a supervisor, I had to figure out how to get my staff together and come up with a common plan of how we're going to meet those minutes. So, I worked really hard and really quickly to come up with plans for all of the teachers to be on the same page and figure out how we're going to go about how we're going to service the students and how we're going to keep track of that. So really quickly, the teachers learned overnight how to, set up Zooms or Google Classrooms, whichever they found easier, and get things set up with the kids as soon as possible. So that was our first initiative. Also, like Katie had talked about, for all students, we had to look at, does everyone have access to internet? And if not, offering packets to all of our students to come up and pick up packets. So it was mostly a lot of quick thinking and trying to get everything done as soon as possible, because we did not want to waste any time. It was critical. And I do truly believe that, not just in my district, that everybody moved so quickly to come up with a plan to make things work for kids as soon as possible. And I think that a lot more time could have been lost, but due to the proactive nature of everybody coming together, that at the very beginning, especially with our students with disabilities, we were able to close those gaps, because we were doing, individualized Zooms with students or small group Zooms to work on their IEP goals, or offering, Google Classrooms where the students can get things done. So those are some of the initial things that we worked on at the beginning of the pandemic.
Talk a bit, you shared with me a list of, I guess you would say, programs that I referenced it a little bit in your introduction about the Edgenuity, but you gave me a list of 4 or 5 other things, programs that you kind of implemented to help those folks with that learning gap. So first of all, you want to talk a little bit about what in the world is this Edgenuity?
Well, Edgenuity is it's an online program. We actually work with West Branch schools. They offer it's an online platform for students that are not able to come to school face to face. So we do understand that especially in year 2 of the pandemic, there was still students that had medical conditions that they were not able to return back to school yet. So Edgenuity is another option for students to go online and receive instruction. And we've also been using it for more credit recovery as well. I tend to call it the COVID pit, whether it's general education or special education students. A lot of students fell into patterns of lack of work completion and kind of just getting used to that alternate type of school day, that they didn't have to work as much. So unfortunately, we have noticed a very big increase in students at the high school level that are credit deficient. So we have been offering this to more and more students to try to get them back to where they need to be credit-wise.
Talk a little bit about Freckle. I just chuckled when you sent me that.
Well, Freckle is one, we just moved our progress monitoring tool from a program called iReady to Star 360. So what Freckle does is it ties individual student data to computerized programming that can provide instruction to students and meet them at their individual needs. So at a district level, we have found that this program has been more effective for our students with disabilities to help close some of those gaps. Luckily, because of the proactive measures we put in place at the beginning of the pandemic, I feel like our students with disabilities are actually in a better place than some of the students that aren't identified. But a program such as Freckle or any other online program that is tied specifically with data gives the teachers the opportunity to provide students with tiered instruction right at their individual level.
It's funny. I think I've been in this education field way too long, because I continue to see that Don Johnston still has programs, and I can remember working for a couple ESCs in the day. What were the programs that you used in regards to that?
Okay, well, so actually, right when we purchased Don Johnson products at the beginning of it was about a week before the pandemic hit. And the Don Johnson programs offered that we really are trying to utilize more are the Snap and Read and the Co-Writer. Snap and Read allows students with more significant reading disabilities to independently access text, whether it's online or whether a teacher uploads a PDF and it can be read to them. And the co-writer helps create a word bank based on a topic that a student is writing on. So unfortunately, because of the pandemic, offering PD like we would have liked to wasn't really in the cards at that time, because it was more of survival mode. So now that we're kind of the dust is settling and we're getting into more PD, our whole special education department has just been retrained in using these the accessibility tools through Don Johnson, just to try to get our students out there in general education more without the need of an aide reading everything for them. A program like Don Johnson or the Snap and Read allows the student to have things read through the computer. So it does foster more independence versus having an adult do the work for the child or read for the child.
Another program, is it pronounced IMSA or is it
IMSC? So
okay.
I'm sure all of the other special education people on here today know there are a lot of changes coming out with the new dyslexia laws. But for some reason, we were already on that bandwagon just before that even happened in Springfield, with trying to increase our numbers of teachers that were licensed and trained in multisensory reading approaches. Orton Gillingham is probably the most researched and supported type of reading program. So IMSC, we are having our entire K-3, actually K-2 staff has fully been trained in the full multisensory approach. And as I kind of mentioned in the information I sent you, again, we're looking at everything as tier 1 and trying to avoid identifying more and more students. So we're trying to provide approaches that maybe typically would have been reserved for special education populations, and implementing layers of them within the general education settings to avoid over-identifying students with disabilities because of the pandemic, which is a concern right now.
You know, I threw this question out at Katie, and I always try to throw it out, you know, as you look back, and, you know, so many of the folks that we've had on these webinars, you know, I really feel if it wouldn't have been thrust on them so quickly to make these changes, I'm so impressed with the programs that were offered in a very short period of time. But, you know, having everything considered, looking back on it, you know, Laura, what are some things that you really feel that you really hang your hat on and say, you know, we did a pretty good job here? And what were some things that you say, you know, was a little bit of a hurdle, but certainly the resilienceness, I guess would be the term. You got over it and moved ahead. So what are some of those things?
Well, of course, I'm always going to brag about my people. It all starts with good people. I have a great special education team, and, you know, once they had good guidance and direction where to go, everybody took off and did their own thing. I think that some good things that came out of this are the enhanced levels of technology that all teachers learned, not just our special education teachers learned. I think it really pushed everybody forward to use more technology. And Google Classrooms, for example, even our intervention specialists have been able to create Google Classrooms just for their students with special needs and make even greater connections with families. And even though the Zooms that we had to do during the time of the pandemic were so stressful, I do think it gave parents a good perspective to see what we are actually doing with their children. In particular, I remember our speech therapist saying how much the parents appreciated viewing those sessions so then they could help their children. So it gave a really rare opportunity for parents to see the world that their children are living in. And I think that was very beneficial for everybody. I think just the fact that we know how much we can utilize Zoom now. Before the pandemic, we had no idea that we could really, use Zoom as an option for meetings. So a lot of our parents are working families and they're busy, and it's hard for them to maybe take off during the day to attend their child's IEP meeting or any other meeting. So now we really have that down, strong, that parents can attend virtually if they would like to. So, in the end, we did learn some new strategies that have helped, I think, build better relationships with families.
And that seems to be important, whether it was Katie talking about it or earlier in the conversation. That family connection, certainly, and family and community connection really came into play during this time and will continue to come into play, don't you think, as we try to build and eliminate that learning gap that all of our students had to deal with during the pandemic.
Absolutely. Even in special education, the number one factor of I think a student's progress is a good working team between the school district and the parents. And I do truly believe that the pandemic has allowed that opportunity to help build better relationships with families. Not all families, but the majority of families that are willing to engage and want to be part of the process. So I found a lot of benefit there.
You certainly try to find that glass half full approach to the pandemic. And that's another thing that's really come out of a lot of these webinars is, the reality of it was here, pandemic was here, we dealt with it. But it's what's really interesting now is talking to educators about, what there actually were some positives that came out of the pandemic. And the overriding one is just this whole concept of virtual communication.
Yeah. I do think now that the dust is settling, I think that overall education is in a really difficult place with trying to manage all of these academic and behavioral needs now that the dust has settled. But I truly believe that everybody in special education has gone above and beyond, and the majority of the special education world, whether it be intervention specialists, speech therapists, occupational therapists, physical therapists, you name it, everybody I saw went above and beyond to try to meet their kids' needs and avoid the students with special needs losing even more. So it was really kind of amazing to watch that process and everybody's determination.
Laura, thank you so much, and keep doing the great things that you're doing out there in Springfield. I would say go Tigers, but it kind of goes against my grain, but I will say it anyway. I really appreciate it, and go Tigers. We appreciate your time.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you. And as we're wrapping up, remote learning is becoming, as Laura talked about, is becoming the new normal for students amid this coronavirus pandemic. But for special needs students, remote learning is proving difficult, especially with a lack of funding. So as we wrap up, let's listen to Meg Oliver. She has a little bit more to talk about.
With more schools set to open next Monday, some districts are scrambling to hire school nurses. Fewer than 40% of schools employed a full-time nurse before the pandemic. Also tonight, there are growing concerns for the 7 million children who receive special education services. CBS's Meg Oliver continues our week-long series, The New Normal, Back to School.
Remote learning has been a tremendous challenge for 6-year-old Calvin Latham.
This spring, a lot of kids with disabilities didn't soar in that environment.
The rising first grader from Virginia has a brain malformation, making him one of 7 million children in the U.S. receiving special education services.
He needs hand-over-hand support for writing exercises and cutting and gluing and the basic things a first grader would do.
Many special education students are legally guaranteed services like an aid through individualized education plans or IEPs. But in a May survey, nearly 40% of parents whose children have an IEP said their kids didn't get any support last spring.
Are you concerned that you're losing something with that one-on-one interaction if you have to go to all remote?
Absolutely.
Angie Abdel-Raham teaches special education in New Jersey.
I do know that there is going to be a lack in what they need to progress.
It's beyond challenging.
John Eisenberg runs the National Association of State Directors of Special Education.
I think you're going to see an increase of lawsuits because schools no matter what cost, probably cannot implement the IEPs in some cases because of the funding shortages.
You're doing great. Without increased funding, Eisenberg says it will be a daunting task to get kids like Calvin back into the classroom. Meg Oliver, CBS News, Montclair, New Jersey.
Once again, thanks so much for attending our continuing series of webinars that we're focusing on the best practices of closing that pandemic learning gap in our Ohio schools. We truly appreciate input from all of our panelists, including ours this evening. This webinar will be part of those resources that are available on our project website, that URL you see at the bottom of your screen. We also continue creating podcasts for each of these webinars that take a deeper dive into the subjects discussed in each of these webinars. Those podcasts can also be found on the project website. Unfortunately, believe it or not, this concludes our webinar series, and we thank all the wonderful and knowledgeable panelists, as well as all of you that have either listened or watched along the way. We thank the Broadcast Educational Media Commission in collaboration with the Ohio Department of Education that really made this project possible. And from the staff at PBS Western Reserve, we thank you for your time in viewing and participating. Have a great night.